Benchmarks are stupid. And unfortunately, if LLMs ever stop progressing, it'll be the benchmark's fault. Why? Because whenever a freaking benchmark comes out, let's say a benchmark comes out and it's called PIS contest, otherwise known as Programming Instruction Super Sampler. This test, when it first comes out, is the new kid on the block. We have these numbers and they're raw. We know that these LLMs have no targeting for this benchmark. But guess what? As soon as the next model comes out, it is no longer the new kid on the block. It is now a benchmark. It is now a regular. And then all of a sudden, guess what happens? All of a sudden, we're starting to see some scores. We're starting to see OpenAI went up to 60. We're starting to see Anthropic went up to 80. As soon as these new benchmarks come out, without fail, the labs start all of a sudden producing better results for these benchmarks. And it's gotten as egregious as companies like OpenAI downright discrediting benchmarks just because they failed. Now, they did give their reasons on why they did this, and sure, but let's be honest, would they have the incentive to go through all of this rigmarole of verifying and testing and making this long-ass fucking article? They would not do this if it weren't for the fact that they were getting beaten. As soon as Grok shows a better result, this benchmark sucks, cut it out. And so they took issue at SWE-bench Pro and said, hey, we're not testing this anymore. And I don't know what started this. I know back in the day, and even today, I guess, we have, video game benchmarks where you're measuring hardware. And in this context, it makes sense. I mean, you could certainly optimize your drivers and put work into optimizing for a specific game. But it's a very definite thing. And you can't really fake this too much. If a graphics card is getting 20 FPS and another graphics card is getting 40 FPS, odds are there's some serious hardware implications here. Unless the drivers are just absolute ass, but I'm assuming the drivers are not terrible. But for whatever reason, some genius that was working on AI decided, hey, we need to copy what we do for video games, right? Because clearly this is so similar, but it's not. And it really doesn't matter what these benchmark creators do. You can employ all these strategies of having private test sets, reducing the predictability of the tests, adding diversity, all these strategies they can keep employing, but all it takes is OpenAI or any of these labs to just focus on this bench for marketing purposes. When Debbie's given her marketing freaking PR slides and she identifies that, hey, PIS contest we're down in these numbers. As soon as that happens, they send off the fleet, man. They send off their entire team to go and figure out how we can pass this freaking benchmark. And so they go off and they figure this shit out. And what happens is, and why I think benchmarks are really going to run us into the freaking stone ages of LLMs and cause stagnation, is because of this part here. They send them on this rat race of solving the PIS contest, and what ends up happening is they degrade elsewhere. If your numbers are going up on PIS contest, guess what? They're probably going down on every other benchmark. You cannot be a master of all. There's certain downsides to everything that you're doing here. To get these benchmarks to perform in a way that we can market it, we're sacrificing the actual meaningful improvements that could be made to these LLMs. And we're seeing this today, right? If you've tried Opus 5, you'll know it has a lot of issues. And this isn't the first time, right? The progression of these LLMs is not progressive as you would think, right? We've seen this time and time again where a new LLM comes out and it's just not as good as we expected. It's worse.
Better than Fable?
For Deep SWE, the best benchmark in my opinion.
An Oxford review of 445 benchmarks found that 84% lack basic statistical testing. Models score 90% on standard tests, but 2% on unseen problems. And this isn't hard to believe, right? LLMs are trained on data, and so if it hasn't seen something before, it's going to be a lot harder. The statistical void is only the first problem. The second is that many benchmarks don't measure what they claim to measure. When we ask AI models to perform certain tasks, we often actually measure completely different concepts or constructs that we aim to measure. And we come to find out cases like this where the models hadn't actually learned to reason about the benchmark, they just memorized the test. And if we think about an LLM having a limited amount of space associated with it, can't just stuff all of our data into the LLM's training set and have it output a good result, right? We want to reduce this as much as possible. But when PIS contest comes out and it's mogging us in the benchmarks, we need to ensure we get some data in here just for that, right? Some PIS specific data. And all we're doing is limiting how much we can fit in here that actually matters to an actual freaking user. And so this is just resulting in us getting more and more stagnated, right? If we didn't have these benchmarks, who knows where we would be? And of course, as we know, benchmarks are going nowhere. They're not going to end, unfortunately. We will see these benchmarks until you and I are 90 years old. For all their flaws, they remain the primary language the industry uses to compare models. The practical question is, which benchmark claims deserve your attention and which are just noise? And so he goes on to specify, okay, does it show error bars? Does it show the passes and the fails? Is the construct defined? Is it giving vague targets, or does it actually specify what it's trying to measure? Has it been contamination tested? We're seeing this with the SWE-bench claim, right? It's all of a sudden super contaminated now that we're losing it. But anyway, I'm kidding. I'm sure there is some actual contamination there, but come on. The timing of it is interesting, right? You didn't notice any other labs pointing at it until they started losing it. So how many questions does it have? So there's some criteria he's giving here, but I want to argue the only good benchmark, right? This is our benchmark salad. The only good benchmark is this. What is this? This is you. The only benchmark that can never be contaminated is your very specific benchmark that nobody knows about, right? And this is going to vary from person to person, right? If you're working on web apps, you might have a certain you should have a certain benchmark that you're running against for web apps. You should have a certain benchmark you're running for anything that you're doing. Ideally, you have your own bench that you just run anytime a new model comes out. Because the thing is, right, an Opus 5 can drop tomorrow, or in this case, let's call it Opus 5.5. It might work amazingly in the piss contest. All the benchmarks line up, and you might even get the typical YouTuber spiel about how good Opus 5 is. Now all of a sudden they're saying it isn't good, but the day Opus 5 came out, we all saw it was constant freaking glazing. YouTubers are constantly glazing these models, right? And so when you look at that, you're like, okay, this must be a banger. I must try it. It must be good. But all they're doing is going off of typically the public benchmarks. You need to have your own set of benchmarks that you run personally to really truly evaluate how an LLM is. This is the only valuable benchmark. And unfortunately, even with this, right, you could spend hours and hours perfecting this. And I do think it matters and it benefits you. But at the end of the day, benches are reasonably stupid. They just are. Because it'll never be perfect and it'll never be consistent. It just won't. I think we all wish that we could just, run a benchmark and compare A/B comparison like this. Imagine a world where we tried to do this with LLMs. I think we would see it as pretty ridiculous because we know that it's not always a guarantee. But the way they tout these benchmarks, it seems like otherwise. It's a very repetitive thing. The very first thing they list in their system cards when they release them are these benchmarks. It's not something that happens later down the line, right? They're not promoting you to think about it and use it yourself on your own tools. They're spewing these benchmarks that they've deemed to be valuable right out the gate. And oftentimes this varies. If you look at the benchmarks that Anthropic is listing here, it's not going to be the same as what OpenAI is listing. They tend to omit the ones they perform worse on. And so I really think LLMs are stifling themselves with these benchmarks. I think it's going to stop us from progressing at a quicker rate than we could be. And in fact, it may, if, depending how things go, we may end up in a case where it downright degrades us. We may never see an improvement to an LLM again if the right benchmarks are getting into the news, into the market. And the problem is, too, is I don't blame them, right? When OpenAI is getting a higher score on a benchmark, it totally incentivizes Anthropic to prioritize and to think about that, and to really fine-tune their model to be good at that one thing. Because unfortunately, benchmarks are what we look at. We can have all these, criteria of what makes a good benchmark, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's only as good as its duration. Any benchmark that's been out before the model came out should really be disregarded. We can sit here and we can try to theorize of what would work, right? There's really only two options here that could work in terms of a reliable, quote-unquote, benchmark. The only reliable, air quotes, benchmark, the one that came after the LM, because then we know there was no fine-tuning or training for it. These come out all the time, but unfortunately, guess what? They don't make the marketing material. Karen is not going to put this in her slides because nobody's heard about it. The private one, if this is a benchmark that truly has had no public disclosure and is really hard to crack, which really that's not impossible. Really, there's no benchmark that could truly be impossible to crack. You can protect a lot of the underlining material. Right, this paper here kind of discusses, having it be kind of not vague and giving actual information. But unfortunately, when you do this, you directly increase the chance that it gets contaminated. And so the only option here is to keep it as private as possible. But even this isn't perfect. And let's say it is perfect. What stops your buddy coming in and saying, hey, you know what, we need a leg up here. Let me just slide you this $1 million so that way you can give us some ideas and information on how this bench works so we can make our model better. Right, there's this company incentive to be greedy here that'll never change because of private models. So this isn't even a good option. So we could sit here all day and theorize what makes a good bench, and I think we'll always come to the conclusion it's impossible. It'll never happen. We'll always find something that could be manipulated and unreliable. Except for your own bench. This is the only one that could ever be reliable, and it only applies to your use case, unfortunately. And so I really hope this doesn't happen, but I really do think it's going to happen. I think we're going to see a decline in the LM progression just because they are focusing on the wrong thing. As soon as a benchmark gets saturated, they're on to the next eye candy. They're going to go from PIS contest to DIC contest, detecting instructional comprehension. And then once the DIC contest goes out, guess what? They're on to the next one. It never freaking ends. We will forever be chasing a benchmark that has nothing to do with our actual use case of the LM and is purely just some under the ground black box privatized thing because we have to keep it private for it to actually be decent. It's crazy. And so do yourself a favor, man. Spend some time here. Find ways to develop benchmarks that apply to your use case, right? There's certain things that you use these LLMs for every day. Go in and build your own benchmark. Spend time on this. Do research on how to build a good benchmark that is directly for you. And then you know for a fact none of this will happen. You'll be able to test that reliably when every model comes out and get a good gist of how it's performing. And then benches won't be our word. They'll be amazing. But you know what? Let's humor this. Let's humor this article. Let's put ourselves in the brain of somebody who really wants this to work out. Right? So as we said before, right, does it show error bars? Only 16% of benchmark include any statistical testing. Without confidence intervals, you cannot distinguish a genuine performance difference from random variation. Anthropic's analysis showed real uncertainty is roughly 3 times what native estimates suggest. If a leaderboard sorts models by raw score with no error bars, the ranking is decorative. And this is pretty reasonable because you think, you could run a benchmark 1,000,000 times until you report the result. If on the 1,000th time it gets a better score than OpenAI, like let's say Anthropic comes out with the 1,000th test, you best believe that's going straight into the PR slides. They're not going to tell you about the 999th times that it failed to get the good score. So that's a valid point. Is the construct defined? Nearly half of benchmarks that provide definitions use vague or contested ones. Reasoning, helpfulness, harmlessness mean different things to different teams. If the benchmark doesn't verify what it means by the construct it claims to measure, the score is uninterpretable. But again, this kind of gets into the realm of, hey, if we reveal this information, are we giving too much away? And so it's a case where to identify a good bench, you need clarity. To beat a bench, you need clarity. So if you give this information away, yes, it's great for us, but unfortunately, this just directly benefits the end lab models that are just going to use this information to train. So it's a tricky situation there. But yeah, you see this all the time, right? It'll say reasoning, helpfulness, harmlessness. A lot of the terms they use in these benchmarks, you're like, what? Like, dude, how am I supposed to actually look at this and know what the hell? Like, oh, dude, I can't wait to use Opus 5. The helpfulness rating is 96%. Like, nobody says that. And that's a funny thing too, right? Whenever we're looking at these benchmarks, nobody points to these benchmarks as actual thing. Right? At the end of the day, I think we all just go off vibes. It just doesn't feel right. This is typically what you hear from a user of an LM because there's just nothing of these benchmarks that you can point to and say, oh, that's that. If you're getting 99 FPS in a video game, at least you can point to it and say, hey, this is something we can measure and look at, right? This video game here is getting 99 FPS. Okay, great. With LMs, we don't get a single metric we can realistically point at and not come across sounding like an idiot, right? If you tell me this model has 75% helpfulness, you're talking straight to the wall. I have no clue what that means in practice. Has it been contamination tested, right? This is another thing. But unfortunately, how can you realistically detect this? The point here is, okay, if the solution files are accessible, maybe there's ways to determine it. But the reality is as soon as an LM comes out, all prior benches are contaminated. This is how we really have to view it. Obviously, this isn't always the case. They can't target every single bench that comes out. But really, we should assume that if the bench was there prior to the LM coming out, it's too late. We can never know for sure whether they targeted one bench or the other. And we can point out numbers like 1,000 questions, which is what I guess what Anthropic recommends. But who decided this number? Where did this number come from? Right? It feels like we're just doing black magic here and we have no clue what's going on. It feels like nobody knows what's going on with these benchmarks. And so none of these questions require a statistics degree. They require the willingness to look past the bold-faced winner and ask, how do you know? In my experience, evaluating models for production, the benchmarks that survive this checklist are rare. The ones that do tend to be the ones built by teams who treat evaluation as a scientific problem rather than a marketing asset, right? And to this point here, that is what you directly get when you build your own damn benchmark. You do this yourself. There's no marketing slides. Karen can't take your benchmark and advertise it. This is a direct benefit only to you, and it is a reliable test, quote unquote reliable. Obviously, these are LLMs at the end of the day. I think you could absolutely run into cases where it just works one day and not the next. They might change the harness on you. The API might just have some finickiness going on. There's so many variables there. But if you're gonna use a bench, which really all benches suck, but if you're gonna use one, at least use your own, right? That's the point here.
Better than Fable, half the price. This is Opus 5.